code amendments that are part of it as well, and then summarize some key points. And next slide. So the Built Environment Accessibility Standard, this is a proposed standard. It's part of the Accessibility Act. It's one of 6 standards that will be developed, and it's the first one to kind of get to this stage. And it has been in the public review process for the last few weeks, and that period ends next Monday, so October 30th. At which time the information will go back to the provincial government, and then any adjustments will happen to the proposed standard, and it will be enacted in 2024. And next one again, please. So the standard has 5 parts, and the first one is regulation. So those are basically the laws that are under this standard that will fall within the Accessibility Act. And those apply to everyone or all organizations, and there are a few that are specifically for prescribed public sector bodies like municipalities. And I mentioned it'll be enacted in 2024, but the requirement to comply will be April 1st, 2026, and that'll apply to any built environment kind of components that are referenced in the regulations that are redeveloped or newly constructed after April 1st, 2026. And there are a few exceptions to that one that I'll mention in a little bit. The second is guidelines. And the guidelines are basically just guidance of best practice for accessibility, but are not mandatory. So anyone can do those at any time, but there's no requirement to do so. Then there are government actions, and those are the responsibility of the provincial government, so not ones that we're involved in as a municipality too much. And then there are building code and fire code amendments, and so building code and fire code are like a separate legislative process, but they're tied in with the standard. It's one of the vehicles being used to basically implement the standard, but it follows its own legislative process. So the expectation is that it will come into effect around the same time as the accessibility, the built environment standard does. And everyone who has to comply with the building code will have to comply with the new building code immediately. So there's not that delay. And again, that's for new and renovated spaces, just like it is now. Okay, so next one, yeah, you're on it. Okay, so I'm gonna highlight a few of the regulations that I think are worth thinking about and kind of planning for. So the first one is around parking areas not associated with buildings. So right now, any parking lot like the one out here, it's associated with the building, so it's covered by the building code, but this was a gap before where parking lots like at parks or trailheads or wharves were not covered by the building code. So adding this as a regulation kind of fills that gap so that there are now going to be requirements for accessible parking and other pedestrian infrastructure at all.
And good luck with the
parking areas.
wharf in Chester.
Well, so again, these are redeveloped and newly constructed things by after that April 1st, 2026 deadline. And the reason I highlight this one is because it will change, how that's approached in the future, right? Because right now, yeah, you put in a parking lot, we're not really identifying accessible parking. So that's one that I think is important to pay attention to and kind of think about going forward. And the next one. So the next one is on-street parking. So this regulation would have a requirement to consult with the community for people with disabilities for the need, the location, and design of on-street parking. And then when on-street parking is done next to a curb, so like you'd need to get from your vehicle onto a sidewalk or over a curb, there are now requirements of what that has to look like. So curb ramps, tactile walking surface indicators.
So does this apply to the province who owns almost all roads?
Yes, this would apply to everybody. Everyone who is responsible for parking, yeah. Okay, so the next one is temporary sidewalks. So for temporary sidewalks, this is one that does need to be complied with on the deadline of April 1st, 2026. So even if there is a temporary sidewalk in place before that date, it will need to still comply with this regulation. It's one of the very few. And basically it just, this regulation clarifies what, the dimensions of what a temporary sidewalk needs to look like when it's, around a cafe, like a sidewalk cafe, a restaurant, or if it goes around a construction zone. So it's quite specific about, dimensions and widths and materials and all of that stuff. And then there are also some there's some information about if we can't comply, then what are the alternatives and that kind of thing. So that would, we're, as a municipality, we're not going out and building temporary sidewalks, but we do have bylaws that govern those right now that would need to be reviewed. And also, if there is construction in the future, any temporary sidewalks that would need to comply with this. Yeah, and that might increase the cost of construction in the future.
Sure.
All right, so the next one is outdoor play spaces. And so this regulation is not incredibly specific, but it does talk about needing to make play spaces accessible to both children and adults with disabilities. And it has some, information about, accessible ground surfacing, which tends to be pretty expensive. And also, making sure there are accessible paths of travel to the various amenities around it or to the adjacent, trails or sidewalks. So this one, it's sort of a bit fuzzy how it'll impact us, because if we were to build a new play space, a new playground right now, we would be building to a high standard of accessibility anyway. We already have a standard that we would use here to inspect playgrounds. So we would likely be building to that standard anyway, which wouldn't be very different to what would be required under this regulation. But where the cost would come in is if we were looking at redeveloping an existing playground or play space, and those renovations tend to be more expensive to bring them up to the current requirements or these proposed requirements. So,
does it have anything to do with, let's say, getting into the playground is one thing, but being able to use all of the equipment is a completely different thing.
Yeah. So it does specifically say about being able to get around, so clearance around play equipment areas, so different parts, different components of a play space. So having the ability to move around, but also having play structures that vary. So some are maybe sensory related, some may be, more physically accessible to an adult or a child who has a disability. And often that's something that we overlook when we think about children's play spaces. We don't think about the caregivers who might be the people who have a disability, or adults themselves who have disabilities who are coming to be with their families. So that's one of the things that is required in this regulation.
But they're not going to tell you, like, say you have a sliding board. You have to go up a ladder to get to it, right?
Yeah, so it's not saying you can't have a slide. It just means we're going to have a variety of things where some of them will be accessible to people of differing abilities. Yeah.
But not all pieces have to be accessible to everybody.
No, I don't think that's the intention.
No.
Yeah. So again, that may change costs, but again, if we're building from scratch, then it's not really going to make a difference compared to how we would do it today. All right, so the next one is around maintenance of parking areas. So this requires that any parking areas that are in the control of the municipality need to have a maintenance plan, and that plan needs to be available to the public upon request. And the plan needs to include things like, how parking spaces, accessible parking spaces are going to be repainted, and the signage is going to be maintained, and the surfaces and those sorts of things. So I would expect that, as new parking lots are developed, they need to meet a higher standard of accessibility, including having accessible, a certain number of accessible spaces. So being able to create a plan, and then also doing the maintenance activities associated with that plan will likely increase the cost a little bit over time. All right, and the next one is around campgrounds. So I was sort of fuzzy as to whether I should include this or not because I've requested some information from the Accessibility Directorate about how we need to comply with this and when, and I haven't heard a response yet. But the regulation basically says that if you have a campground that's front country, meaning it's accessible mainly by car, then it needs to have a specific number of accessible sites per the number. So for Kaiser Meadows, which is the only campground that's owned by the municipality, based on the numbers that are provided, there would need to be one accessible campsite, and that means upgrading that one site to include things like a specific type of surface material, an accessible picnic table, and then accessible paths of travel to an accessible washroom facility and potable water, neither of which are on site right now. So it's not clear to me from the language in the proposed standard whether we would need to add a washroom or not. So that's something that I'm waiting to hear more information from the directorate about. But if that were the case, that would be a pretty significant cost. All right, so there's one other draft general regulation under the Act that I think is important for us to think about, and that it's a little bit different than the other regulations. This one would change our obligations as a municipality in our accessibility plans. So as you're aware, we have an accessibility plan that was done regionally and was submitted to the province in 2021. And that has to be updated every 3 years. So the next update is in the spring of this coming year, 2024. So by 2026, this regulation would say that all of the accessibility plans would need to have a plan included in them to address the lack of accessible washroom facilities in buildings. And we've had conversations here about the municipal buildings and access to appropriate accessible washroom facilities. So my interpretation of this is that we would need to include that in our next update, which is in 2024. So that's really soon. So that makes this a little bit I say urgent, but it may not even be passed by that time. So my expectation is that it should be included in our next plan regardless. And when I say a plan to address accessible washrooms, it doesn't necessarily mean that every building has to have an accessible washroom facility, but it means there needs to be a plan on how to make that happen or how to provide information to people who may need those facilities on where else they can find them or alternatives. Okay, so there are many building code amendments. And as I mentioned, they're kind of a separate legislative process, but anything new or renovated will need to follow these, assuming they get passed as they are. So I didn't want to read, the many amendments, but I thought I would highlight a few so that you have a sense of what we're talking about in these changes. So like, for example, one of the changes to the building code is that instead of 50% of pedestrian doors to a building being accessible, all of them now need to be accessible except for service doors. So if we were to build a new building, it would need to be with that in mind. Another is around power door operators. There's an increased number of where those need to be in a building, not just the entrance doors anymore. And also barrier-free paths of travel. So those will now need to be slightly wider and have more clearance to allow people to turn around. And the next one. And again, just a few examples. This one has to do with washroom facilities. So the requirements for accessible washroom facilities has just become more accessible. So examples are requiring now limited mobility stalls in washrooms that have lots of washroom stalls. So limited mobility stalls are kind of a cross between a regular stall and an accessible stall. So they have the grab bars and are a bit larger. But they're not the full size and have all the features of an accessible stall. So that's a new requirement. Some changes in where universal washrooms have to be located in buildings. And then also if showers are provided to the public or to staff in a building, then they also need to have accessible showers provided. And my last slide on this is just, more examples of changes to the building code, and those would be related to slightly more accessible parking spaces required in parking lots, and the dimensions are a little bit different as well. And then just kitchens and break rooms need to have more accessible features than they have before. Okay, so to kind of summarize some of these things, I wanted to note that the Municipality of Chester has already done a lot to increase accessibility in the time that I've been here the last few years. I've noticed that the CSA B651, which is the accessible design for the built environment, has been used quite a lot, and that is best practice in Canada for accessibility in the built environment right now. So that's been used as a reference quite a lot for measurements and other projects that have been happening, and so we're already using that a lot, which means we're kind of farther ahead than we would have been otherwise with these regulations. And staff are already kind of incorporating accessibility into project planning. And you may have seen that in the Wild Rose project, Wild Rose Park project. There's lots of accessibility being incorporated into that already. And just applying an accessibility lens, and that's been part of my role, coming in and looking at a project or looking at a report or looking at something and trying to see where accessibility fits or has been missed. So that's already been happening. So I think that with those things that have been happening already, these regulations are slightly less jarring than they might have been otherwise.
Yeah, because we're already trying to do it.
Yeah, exactly. So the next slide, please. I don't want to pretend like there's not going to be a change though.
Oh, yeah.
So there will be, if this goes ahead as is, there will be some change in the requirements for staff time to do some of this work, and also budget allocation to manage it. And I just have a few examples, just like the fact that we have to create several plans related to, we talked about parking lot maintenance. There's also snow control, snow and ice control maintenance, that kind of thing, that need to have plans and be able to be communicated to the public. Then maintenance activities themselves, and then costs of renovations. So when renovations do happen, they will need to meet this higher level of accessibility, and we know that that's really difficult in old buildings. They just don't have the space and the flexibility to meet a lot of these requirements easily. So that costs a little more for design, and sometimes it's just not feasible. And my last point there, the cost of construction. When there's the research out there on this shows that when you build a building from scratch to a really high accessibility standard, it really doesn't cost a whole lot more than if you build to kind of code minimum, so like a lesser standard of accessibility, which we know doesn't meet the needs of a lot of people with disabilities. So the difference in the research is only between 1% and 8% of cost increase to meet a really high standard. So when I say there's going to be a cost increase when there are new builds, that's true, but it's probably not as much as we're imagining when we think, we have to make it super accessible. So it's really less than 10% of a cost difference for a whole new building.
Renovations.
It's the renovations that get you, yes. Yeah. All right, so I wanted to close by kind of circling back to why this legislation was brought in the first place. And we have 30% of our population of adults in Nova Scotia who say that they have a disability, who report having a disability. And many of those people encounter barriers in the built environment when we don't do a good job of making it accessible. And that prevents people from participating in their communities the way that everybody else has the opportunity to do. So in kind of being kind of up to my ears in this the last few weeks, talking to people around the province about how they feel about this proposed standard, what I'm getting is that people with disabilities tend to be feeling like it's good and it's going to make a difference, but it also may not go as far as they would like because it doesn't require retrofits to existing buildings, meaning those barriers are going to continue to exist unless individual organizations choose to go back and change them. But on the other hand, there is a balance to be struck, that you as a municipality and all of the other organizations who need to comply, this does present some challenges. So, with all of that, it seems like it kind of meets a pretty good balance from my perspective. So what I'm doing in terms of the review process, the public engagement process, is I've supported the Lunenburg County Accessibility Advisory Committee to write a letter with their feedback to the directorate about this standard or proposed standard. And I've also collected feedback from staff across the 5 municipalities, and that will be done as a submission through the website, the public engagement website. And that's anonymous, but it's kind of the way that they're streamlining all of the feedback. So that is kind of where we stand right now.
Are there any exceptions for historic properties?
So that is one of the government actions that the provincial government will work to try to clarify that. It's a fuzzy area at the moment, and I've been working with Lunenburg and the town of Lunenburg in particular to try to get some clarity around that, because it is there are conflicting values, right? Yeah. So I think some of the feedback I've heard from the various municipalities is that there are going to be some challenges around that. So I'm expecting that the directorate will get feedback on that topic.
Yeah, well, like some of the entrances, to these historic properties just do not meet, and if you change them, then you take away from the historic.
Yeah, you're starting a big conversation around values and around competing priorities. So it's a big topic.
Yeah.
And it is being explored. So that is again one of the government actions.
No real decision made yet.
Not yet.
How we deal with that.
Yeah, although it does say in the regulations at the beginning of that section very clearly that there are no exceptions and no partial compliance. So when we get the final version, when it's passed, it will be interesting to see what actually ends up being the exact wording of everything.
Anyone? I've pretty much said it all of me.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I'm on the accessibility committee. It's a big discussion for us here because of our building, not other places, but our building here. Renovations as opposed to new. So, that's a huge conversation for us here. And I guess I look forward to with the Tammy and the team, because you started to develop a plan with the town of Mahone Bay.
Yeah.
And that really is amazing to me, because I know it's a different area, but their building is quite old here too.
Yeah.
And they sure have challenges there, I'm sure. But I think we have a bigger discussion about this moving forward, I can see.
Yeah. Oh yeah, we got to do it. I get it in public places, but. Anyone else?
No, I think it's going to be a work in progress. To say you have a definite date for changes would be very difficult. I work at a place for individuals with various disabilities, and the building that they're in isn't even accessible 100%. So, they haven't really complied. They have a lot of improvements, but certainly there are spaces which are not accessible for a population that is disabled.
Yeah.
So I think we have a lot of work to go, and it's expensive.
Yeah, it was renovating. Anyone else? If not, thank you very much, and you should be fine with whatever your time frame is for where you're supposed to be next.
Very well. Thank you very much.
Okay, 9.2, request for decision, corporate strategic management, Chester Fire Hall conceptual design.
Yeah, that's me.
What is it?
So we have, back in June, council and the village commission approved a scope of work for the new fire hall in Chester. That was for the conceptual design and cost estimate. Now we have, or since then, the municipality led the procurement for that project. We had 7 firms bid, and 21 suppliers took out the documents to review them. We had 7 who actually bid on the project. And an evaluation committee was formed that included representatives from the municipality, so fire services, engineering, and executive, as well as the Chester Village and the fire department. So they went through about a 2-week process to evaluate the bids and came up with a recommendation for award. And the Chester Fire Services Committee met on October 4th to discuss the evaluation team's recommendation. And they endorsed the awarding of the conceptual design and cost estimates to the highest score proponent, which is Acre Architects. So there's a motion in the request for decision from the Fire Services Committee. So they are looking for an approval of this award recommendation, subject to the Chester Fire Services Committee becoming incorporated, as well as subject to the Chester Village Commission also approving the recommendation to award. And the Village Commission is meeting today with the same request for decision. So the recommended motion is subject to approval of both the Chester Village Commission and Municipal Council, and subject to the incorporation of the Chester Fire Services Committee, approve the award recommendation to Acre Architects for the conceptual design and cost estimates for a new Chester Fire Hall at a lump sum fee not to exceed $106,000, HST not included.
So moved.
Can I ask a question?
Let's have, no, we have a mover, we have a seconder. Seconder, question.
Who's paying for this? I wasn't clear.
It would be the Fire Services
Okay,
Committee.
great.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
they have $50,000 in the budget for this fiscal, and they're expecting it to go into next fiscal.
That's what I was reading that, but I wasn't
Yeah.
clear. Perfect, thank you.
Nina?
I have a question around the incorporation of the committee itself. So where in the scheme or the process are they with that?
So we have the insurance figured out, so we were waiting on the incorporation piece until that was arranged, so that's been done. And right now, we are waiting for the incorporation documents to be mailed, is that correct?
They've been filed with registered joint stock.
Oh,
There we go.
But they haven't issued this, or they know they haven't issued the certificate.
Sure, yeah, well,
So we're just waiting for a certificate, really.
couldn't be closer, really. Does that usually take time? You don't know?
Not many of these are incorporated.
Oh.
This is not like a regular company where it's done pretty much, as soon as you file, it's done.
Anyway, we've done all our work and we're just waiting for a certificate.
Yeah.
So,
A second question, not to that, but a separate one. So near the bottom, it referenced communication channel through the project manager, and the project manager is assigned as the committee's project point person, primary contact. So that's an individual that's appointed by the Fire Services Committee, I
Yes.
assume?
Yeah,
And where we're this close, has that been done yet?
not yet, no.
So I assume that would be the first step following the award of the contract? Because
Yes.
again, it's on them and not our staff to carry the heavy load, right?
That's correct.
Okay, good.
any further discussion on the motion? All those in favor? Opposed? The motion is carried. 9.3, Village Planning Review, prepared. Community Development Creation.
Good morning, Council.
Morning.
So what we heard report was contained in the package, but I put together some slides which are essentially the same, a summary of the same comment, and I thought that would be probably the best way for us to at least begin to work through these items and get some direction from you. So so we'll jump right in. So essentially, just quickly, we'll start with a summary of the public engagement that we did this summer in support of the village plan review. So there's a list there of the meetings. Essentially, we brought it to council on July 6th and then to the village planning advisory committee shortly after. We then held a series of 4 public meetings. It came back to village planning advisory again in August. Then there was a series of staff met one-on-one and had a number of phone calls while we were receiving written comments as well at the same time. So the purpose of the what we heard report really is to collate and group those comments and feedback into categories, have some discussion here with council, and then get some direction from council as to how we proceed. I have, and I did want to note that the original comments are all attached to the report as an appendix for information, so that there's hopefully you can see that that's a good reflection of what we heard. So the way the slides go today, basically I've got a few notes of context, some sort of summary of public comments, and then followed by some options. With the options, you'll see it kind of varies from topic to topic. In some cases, we might want to choose several options. It's not to say we only have to choose one. And if council doesn't see something there they like, we can totally go off script. Those aren't to say those are the only options. They're just kind of the initial thoughts that I had and kind of discussion starters, I guess, to get us going.
Yeah.
Obviously, subject to any different direction, if we, unless council says otherwise, basically what we'll do after today is take that direction and then work to produce sort of the next draft of the documents, update the things that we've talked about here. So, so we'll jump right into it. So the first issue was around potable water and the density proposed, I guess, in the new plan. So this was definitely one of the two most discussed topics at the public sessions. The new plan policy does note that there's no immediate solution for central water in the village, at least proposed currently. But we did hear significant concern with virtually sort of any form of new development and the impact on existing water supplies or concern around that. Some of the comments that we heard, ranged from there should be no new development, basically keep it as it is. We heard that density was not appropriate in the core. And that there were also, we heard some interesting sort of different ideas to look at other sources of water, like that other parts of the world use, like desalination plants and things like that I don't believe have been thoroughly explored in the past. So in terms of options here, if we can just go to the next slide. Yep. And again, these are just for discussion. So one of the most drastic things we could do would be to eliminate 2-unit dwellings and accessory dwellings in the R1 and R2 zone. That would significantly limit the number of new dwelling units in the core. It would actually, and it's interesting, and I think there is, based on the comments that we've received, there is a lot of misunderstanding with what's in the current plan and how the new plan changes or doesn't change or adds to that. So for example, in the R2 zone where we've proposed to allow 2-unit dwellings as of right, with some design controls on how they look from the street, currently that's possible through something called residential conversion. Any structure that's been in existence since 2004 can be divided into 2 units in that zone. So really, is it a change? Yes, but it's a very slight change. It's not going from nothing to everything can have 2 units. So I think there is some misunderstanding there, but we could, if that's the will of council, we could basically pull out many of those provisions that allow new looking to add. Yeah. There were some suggestions that new developments should essentially be required to install a cistern or other sort of on-site water supply to ensure that they're not going to affect neighboring properties. We'd have to do some research on sort of the authority and ability to require that. That would also, again, significantly increase the cost of construction for those new units, but that is an option. There also were some good suggestions and comments made around sort of low flow fixtures and rain or water saving devices. So that's certainly something we can do. Again, we would research this. It's unclear how much of that could actually be regulated versus guidelines and public education campaigns. We have the water strategy that could potentially be a piece that we add to that on education of best practices for rain barrels and low flow fixtures, those kind of things to try to help make the best use of the water that is here.
But we don't have the ability to regulate that.
We'd have to do some further investigation to determine exactly where we can and can't under the MGA. Yeah,
It doesn't jump out at me that they have authority, but we'd have to research.
yeah, it would be a new venture, I guess. So there'd be that. Yeah. So we could investigate that, and if it was possible to regulate, we could consider regulations, or if it wasn't, then we could do, like I said, guidelines and education. That's right. Another idea that came up was we could, and this may be seen as pushing the buck down the road, but we could add policy to the secondary plan to essentially say that by the next plan review, which is roughly 10 years, that the council is going to commit to, say, an aquifer study or providing central water. That would be, again, sort of the number 1 and number 4 are maybe in two opposite directions in terms of maybe the more, I don't know what to say, extreme, but the more, those options. And then, of course, there was an option to make no change in this area. I know and like I said, this was, hours of discussion combined into 2 slides here, so I'd be happy to try to elaborate, or if there is any
I just wonder what the best approach to this morning is if we just try to come to some consensus on each one, or if we wait to the end, or...
We could certainly do that. We could go through them all and then come back to the options, whatever council's wishes are.
Andre?
Gareth, can you give me a sense of how many properties, actual lots we're talking about here? If we talk about R1 and R2, like, are we talking about 100 lots?
So this
50. What is this?
Right. So this is it's a significant number of lots, and this is not dealing with the subdivision of those existing lots.
I understand.
We've got that on a separate page. So it's essentially the majority of it would be the R1 is the 3 peninsulas, and then the R2 is essentially the core village, so surrounding us here. So it would be well over 100 lots in total. Yeah.
And the R2 can already subdivide, or their dwellings into 2.
Yeah, that's right. If it's been there since 2004,
Most
which
of them have
the
been.
majority have been, they can do something called residential conversion, which...
So I guess really I'm interested in R1.
Right. So R1 currently allows a small secondary unit of, I believe it's up to 600 square feet in size. In the new proposal, we're proposing to allow that to go up to 1,000 square feet in size as an accessory dwelling unit. But then there's the lot size and the subdivision piece, which, like I said, I've got on a separate slide here. So in the R1 zone, excluding the subdivision question, there's no change in the number of units. Right now, you can have a single unit plus the guest house kind of idea. And we're proposing to essentially just allow that to get a little bit bigger and a little bit more flexibility where it goes. It could be in an accessory dwelling or as a basement apartment, something like that. And again, the R2 zone, most could currently go to 2 units. There is a change in the R2 zone in that what we're going to say, what we're saying in the new plan is that every house could apply to become a 2-unit, but there is also that ability for the accessory dwelling unit, which would be a third unit. If somebody was able to meet all of the setback regulations and requirements. I'm not sure if I answered the question.
Yeah, well, sounds close, yeah.
Although it's not listed here, I think part of the underlying concern is also the look of like townhousey type development. And, how is that addressed in this?
Yeah, so in the R2 zone, in order to make your single unit into 2-unit, or to build a 2-unit, it has to, the entryways, we've addressed that, so we say that it can't look like a traditional duplex, a mirrored image on either side. There can be, basically the way it's worded is you could have a single entrance with, so everybody goes in one entrance and then you go off to each unit, or you could have a second entrance around the side or the back. So the intent there is that from the street, it will still continue to look like a single unit home. It'll just, interior will be divided in a way to create multiple units. Could be top and bottom, or it could be split sideways, or yeah. So that's the intent there, and that provision is not in existence today. So if somebody went through that residential conversion today, they could have the traditional sort of put another front door in the house.
Well, I think there's one on Queen Street
Right.
looks a little bit better in Middle Sackville, probably.
Right. So the intent here would be to kind of get rid of that existing clause so that every home could do it regardless of whether you're there since
But
2004.
with this change, that would prevent that.
But hope the intent there would be to improve the look of any new 2-unit buildings. That's right. Yeah.
Any other questions before we move on? Okay.
I know it's a big one to just start
the
with,
whole
but it
thing
was
is.
yeah.
Yeah, and I see going through it, because when we get to the density issue, for
Yes.
example, on the peninsula,
Yeah.
I think there's no question we're gonna make changes there, and some of those changes may impact on this.
That's right, and it's a cumulative effect
It's a
too.
cumulative
Right.
So I like to go through it, and at some point, I would think that once we come up with draft 2, we're gonna go back to the public with it as well before we go to public hearing. I mean, this is a big deal, so we gotta make sure we're not gonna get everybody on side, we know that, but
Yeah.
we wanna make sure everybody has a chance to comment properly on whatever the next draft is gonna be. I would say we should get it right by draft 3.
Well, that'll be the best you can hope for. Okay.
Okay, so we'll move on. So again, the next one, and to the comments we were just saying, this is all kind of related overall to density, but this specific issue came up, and again was one of the more significant, or the issues we heard about the most. So this is the proposed changes to the R1 zone, which is currently the estate residential zone, which is the 3 peninsulas plus a few little areas in the core. And I think something that I also probably didn't potentially make clear enough at the public sessions, or at least I've realized it didn't come through, is that virtually all, like in this case, a lot of these changes came from our FBM consultant on the character study. So they suggested a reduction in this lot size too, and that was in the guise of that overall preserving the character of the village. That said, it's not to put the blame on them by any means. I took their recommendations, and then the numbers are my own here. So
To be fair, that was the village element study,
yes,
and we had extensive public meetings on that as well.
That's right.
It's not like it was taken over.
no, that's right. There were several public meetings that were well attended and generally well received at the time. And there seems to be a disconnect. We heard numerous times that, well, where are all those good ideas that were at that study? And in fact, they're virtually all in this plan. So,
But anyway, we've heard a lot about this particular issue.
right. So basically, the draft documents propose a significant reduction in the minimum lot size from 40,000 square feet to 10,750 square feet. In addition to that, the yard setbacks have been reduced accordingly in order to allow development on those smaller lots. But again, we did hear significant opposition, both from folks that live in that zone and from people that live outside of that zone. There was a lot of discussion that is a significant, those large lots with large homes are a significant element of the character of the village, and that by allowing potentially 4 buildings per lot, which in practice would be virtually impossible to meet because of our other subdivision requirements, on-site septic requirements, road access, and the plethora of other things that you have to do. But regardless, that was the sentiment, was that if that was the result, that we had 4 homes on every one of those lots, that would totally ruin what...
It would change things.
Yes, absolutely.
That was never going to happen because of the other regulations, but that's the disconnect.
Right. So, and again, there were some elements that came through the FBM study in that were related to the size of structures. So we've heard some complaints recently that some of the new structures that have been built are just far too large, even for what's the norm in that zone. So there is a proposed maximum footprint of new buildings and also a lot coverage provision. And so the intent in the draft plan was to bring all of those provisions in to try to preserve that building on a lot with a significant yard around it. Just the whole lot would be smaller, but the building would be smaller too. That concept was not well received. I think that it was clear that there was a lot of opposition and literally only a handful of support, comments supportive of that, of allowing more subdivision in that zone. And this will, if we look at the options here, I've tried to kind of provide a variety, obviously. So the first one would be, can we just go to the next slide, please? Yeah. So the first one would be to put the minimum lot size back, put the yard setbacks back to as they are today, 40,000 square feet, 25-foot yard setbacks, but to maintain the proposed minimum footprint and lot coverage provisions that came out of the character study. And again, that would prevent really large buildings from being built, which again, we have had examples and heard complaints about.
Yeah.
Next option would be, oh, sorry, yeah, go
No,
ahead.
I just want you to make sure I understand this right. And for the benefit of anybody maybe watching here. So in subdivision, like if I had a lot, I have to satisfy certain criteria to subdivide a lot. Since this has been going on for a long time. So there are municipal requirements such as road frontage and minimum size requirements. And then in some cases, there may be also provincial requirements that supersede that.
Right.
So on sites that are serviced by on-site sewage, which we have some within the village, such as the entire Chester Peninsula, about half of Walker Road and Walker Road Extension, those are all serviced by on-site sewage. So before setting aside road frontage and lot area, which are municipally controlled through our land use policy, you then have to satisfy the province's requirements for on-site sewage, which is based on what criteria?
Soil type and the lot area.
So the depth of permeable soil.
Right, that's right, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's an assessment.
So if you have a lot and you want to subdivide it to, you have to dig a test pit on the proposed lot,
right,
as well as the existing lot,
to determine,
even if it has a septic system,
right, to determine a replacement.
And you determine what the depth of soil is, a qualified person does, and then based on that, there's a table. And so in that table, do you know what the minimum lot size is?
I don't off the top of my head.
So the minimum lot size is 0.6 of an acre, but that assumes that you have the best sandy soil that does not exist in Chester, especially in the peninsula and at the end of Walker Road. Well, Walker Road's a little bit better. So realistically, you would be sort of what they would call a category 2 lot, which would mean the minimum lot size you could create in those zones, probably per the provincial standard, would be around 1.1 acres per lot, right? So in those areas, even though they are R1, and the municipality could allow a smaller footprint, the province, because it's serviced by on-site sewage, would not allow that. So those zones, if we're concerned about the character of decreasing lot size in those areas, those will remain unchanged because the provincial policy has not changed. And I don't think there's any intent to change it. And this is a very common thing in other areas or other jurisdictions. Oftentimes the municipalities' requirements are smaller than what the province will allow if you're serviced by on-site sewage. So in the R1 zone, if you take out the ones that are actually regulated by the on-site sewage regulations, the province's on-site regulation, what are we left with?
To your point, there's a number of small undersized lots here in the core of the village, and then there would be, like you said, the areas that are served by sewer on Noss Point and the beginning of Walker.
And I understand that 46% of those lots are already undersized?
Yeah, in that ballpark, that's right. There's a significant amount that don't meet the 40,000 square foot already.
I feel, because I've heard a lot of feedback about, especially from the water, there's a character that exists when you're in your boat and you look back on Chester and you can see these estate homes, but largely those are like the peninsula and the end of Walker Road. Those will remain untouched, really, because they're protected by the province's on-site sewage regulation. This change doesn't affect those properties.
I would agree, yeah.
I just want to make that clear,
Unless we run the sewer there.
unless we do, but that is,
That's not on the agenda.
that's not on the table at this point.
But I think that what you've heard, what I've heard, is that on the estate residential side, the people who live there don't want any change. That's right. So I mean, that's.
Yep.
On the R1 zone, we could leave it at 40,000. We have the minimum footprint, lot coverage provisions.
Right.
Could we ease off on the setbacks and not make any significant? Because we got undersized lots there too.
Yes, that's right.
Not
And there,
all 40, we gotta deal with the existing lots as well.
yes, yeah. So you mean reduce the
I'm
setback?
just wondering, what would that do? Would it give a little more flexibility on building? Would it
Yeah,
change?
I think depending on how, to what extent we're talking, at some point, again, the proposed setbacks were much smaller and those were seen as
Yeah.
part of the characters having, yards, large
Agreed.
yards on all
Agreed.
sides. But yeah, there is the issue of those existing undersized lots, and that actually, option 3 here kind of touches on that, which is that one, and again, potential combination of options here. We could choose to say leave the R1 zone alone in terms of the lot size, or revert it to the existing lot size and setbacks, but also do a review for those undersized lots in other parts of the village and potentially look to change those to R2 to allow them to better make use of the property. Because you're right, there are some existing lot owners of undersized lots that are struggling to develop them because of those 25-foot setbacks and some of the other requirements in that zone. They're on 8,000 square foot lots, but they're dealing with provisions that are meant for 40,000 square foot lots. So that,
I'd like to see that change made, but the rest of it, I think,
Should stay the same.
I'm gonna be looking at keeping the existing 40,000.
so that might be option 1 and 3. And I'm not
Are you
asking
saying,
you to-
Councilor Vito, that, reduce it? We're not gonna, it's not
I
gonna
think it's
matter.
crazy
It's not gonna
to
matter.
have a service lot that's an acre in size. That's insane.
Service lot, we're talking now, let's take Niles Point out of it for a minute, because that's the only service one here.
Yes,
But the peninsula is not service.
that's not, and that will remain unchanged.
Yeah.
And it is possible to have a zone that says lots without access to the central sewer have these provisions, lots with access have this, or rezone to a different.
We probably can agree then by consensus that if there's no sewer, it stays at 40,000, maybe an easing of the setback.
Absolutely, and that's gonna happen anyway.
It's gonna happen anyway.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's why those on-site regulations are in place. But it costs a lot of money to transmit sewer down a road, and when you have lots of that size,
You don't even need to.
it's crazy. Crazy. I don't see that anywhere. I mean, I work all over the province. I've never seen it anywhere. It's nuts.
We're at service.
Serviced. 1 acre minimums.
Well, that was the discussion in the study last summer. That was a large part of the discussion. But then we're just narrowing it down to Niles Point, where I live. I don't have a conflict or not, but I'm against reducing the lot sizes. There's nothing there to develop anymore, pretty much. Willie's the only one here from Niles Point. Is there anything left up there to develop?
Well, I feel like, I just feel like it's nutty to do this. And should there be some instance where there's some scrap of land somewhere that could be used appropriately with appropriate setbacks, but not an acre, then I don't really see the barrier here. Like I struggle.
But
Like I don't see this as gonna ruin Chester, honestly, because most of it is already protected through the on-site sewage regulation. 46% of them are already undersized. Those that aren't have houses right in the middle of them. So like, we're talking about like this big
Okay, but
outrage is about like maybe 5 instances or something like that,
we
really?
basically agreed though that on the on-serviced area, we're gonna have to keep the larger lots maybe and take a look at the setbacks. So we separate that from the only one that's in the R1 that is serviced is Knott's Point, and there's most of our lots, I know Willie's lot's undersized, mine is undersized, next door's undersized, but they're already built on. And they're not, you know.
And even if they, even if
No
your
matter what you
structure
make,
would.
you can make them 5,000, you're not gonna be able to build on them because there's no room.
Yeah, sure.
So, you know, pick your poison.
There is gentrification of communities. That's something we know it happens. So in 10, 15, 20 years, somebody may come in and remove a structure. And this provides a vehicle, an option, the flexibility to develop it in a more sustainable
It
way,
would do that.
potentially. But there are a number of other requirements. I mean, you have to have road frontage, you have setback requirements. All these things are requirements.
But the thing is, we have a battle on an issue that really can't happen based on other regulations.
And nobody's putting a gun to anybody's head to change their lot.
So I think the consensus is we don't change it, but again, it makes no sense if you're starting from scratch on a serviced area to have 1 acre lots. But we're actually not dealing with an area where you have any potential future development. There are a few lots up there, but they're over an acre, or they don't have access, so wouldn't get the approval anyways. I just don't see it's a hell I want to die on. I'd like to see it leave the way it is.
Well, we go out to the public and ask for their opinion for a reason.
We have their opinion, and we know what the consensus is, and that's, I'm not going to go with necessarily,
Well, everybody that lives there doesn't want to change.
all they can.
That's.
There are certain areas we're not going to get a consensus on. We have to make a decision. This one we have a consensus on. I happen to agree with it. And
Other
that's what I'm going to
projects in
vote
other
on.
areas, same thing.
I know it doesn't make any sense at a theoretical level. And down the road, they can take another look at it.
Shall we'll move on?
Just keep moving
Yep.
on.
Okay, so the next, and again, these are the first couple being the most talked about. These from now on are kind of in no particular order. So the next one was.
You got over all the hard ones?
But so the next one was around the marine development zone. So just as a reminder, this zone was proposed to replace the marine industrial zone, which is currently basically only located on the Heisler Boatyard properties and surrounding properties. In the proposed draft, we've continued that with the marine development zone, except we've also proposed to extend it to the rope loft properties as well. And the zone itself is intended to sort of allow for some more development in those areas, expand some of the permitted uses, and gradually move away from the industrial use to potentially more of a waterfront, commercial waterfront use. So it has some options for commercial uses, restaurants, those types of things, and it does permit light industrial in the areas where it has been existing. But we did hear some comments, a few at the public sessions and also in some of the one-on-one meetings, that zone either could or should be considered for allowing residential uses. And that could be either as part of a commercial development or it could be a standalone residential use. So as drafted, the zone allows for example, it allows for short-term rentals and a hotel and restaurants, but it doesn't allow for a apartment building or that kind of thing. So
We could put a hotel there.
in the marine development zone by development agreement.
By development.
Yeah, that as drafted, that's right. So the options here, we can make no changes and keep it as is. We could permit standalone multi-unit residential by development agreement. That would be in keeping with what we have in, say, the core commercial zone. Or we could permit, again, similar to the core commercial zone, residential uses in combination with a commercial use. So you have maybe you have a building for boat tours and rentals and office space, and then above it there's some apartment units or something like that are built close to the water. This wasn't, an extreme one that we heard extremely loudly, but those were some of the suggestions that we had heard. So we wanted to bring it forward for discussion.
I think that the marine industrial is pretty much history. So you gotta figure out.
Yeah, so it's do we want to kind of limit it to commercial, or do we want to also open it into residential, commercial, mixed use kind of ideas?
I think modern marinas now have a residential component. People, especially around here, you know, they have condos and they keep their boat at the marina, and then, you know, once boating season's over, they go to probably the other place where they have their other boat.
Right.
In a warmer
I
climate.
think we have to add more flexibility to it, Gary.
Yeah, it's just a question of, yeah.
What's the, this is when we need Butch, where's Butch when we need him, eh?
Yeah, he tell us.
I know you've talked to Eileen.
Yes.
What's her thoughts on,
Generally, she was. I mean, there's an email included here as well, so I don't want to misrepresent. But generally, she's supportive of the zone, I would say. I specifically on this question, I wouldn't want to speak to her
okay, that's fine.
whether she has a strong opinion one way or the other. But generally, in terms of the general marine development zone concept, was supported.
Yeah, okay. But I think to Andre's point, some flexibility would be,
Yeah, we need to make it more flexible because industrial is just, it's history.
Yeah. So we could open up, and again, we can either come back to this, or on these easy, I shouldn't say easy, smaller ones, we could, put up the council's
you would
wishes.
pick up a consensus from our comment.
Right.
probably.
Well, I'd like direction. At the
Well,
end
so
of the
what
day.
do we want them to do?
I think we want to allow
Yeah.
like multi-unit buildings in there, so that, but it's gotta have like stringent architectural control.
And by
So
development,
that it has to look right, and it has to have certain size provisions on there and setbacks. So you can't put a skyscraper at the water line, because then everybody back on the hill.
Paint your guys.
Well, not even that, but we
Hates
have to
Batman.
ensure that they have water supply and all that kind of stuff.
Right. And a development agreement would likely be the best tool
Probably
to
the
go
best
through
way,
the requirement
so that we
studies
can-
and have the public input as well.
On every project,
Right.
yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
great, yeah. So the next one is short-term rental regulations. So again, this is your Airbnb, VRBO, anything that essentially is less than 28 days and isn't under the Residential Tenancies Act would be considered a short-term rental. Generally, the short-term rental regulations were well received at the public sessions. As the engagement period went on, we did start to hear some concerns from some operators of short-term rentals and from some folks in the service industry that, support either, say, yard work or housekeeping types of services, those kind of things. There generally was, so we have, I guess just as a quick summary, so what we've proposed is in residential zones, short-term rentals would be permitted, one per lot, but you have to be the primary resident in order to operate it. So, that the new rules would be a little bit different than how we normally would bring in new regulations. In this case, there would be no grandfathering, so any existing short-term rentals would have to come in and get a permit for the new standard. That was generally pretty well received. That idea that
except by the people who have the
of course, yeah.
existing.
But I think that, okay, yeah, fair enough. In my take, the consensus at the public sessions was that there was a lot of support for not grandfathering in existing short-term rentals.
Yeah.
We did, and again, as the engagement period went on, like I said, we heard from operators. We also heard from people that things such as like the junior sailing program and other traditional summertime activities here essentially are done through short-term rentals, whether it's an Airbnb or whether it's an arrangement, but not through a long-term rental. And so what the impact might be on that.
How did you define long-term?
28 days or more, it falls under the Residential Tenancy Act. So yeah, that's kind of the cutoff that basically everybody is using provincially. Yeah. And then we also heard again towards the end of this, and that's not to say that from a number of property owners who had say purchased a property with the intent to rent it periodically for a number of years, and then eventually they would, when they retired, they would move, be here for 6 months in the summer, that kind of thing, and that, they had based that financial plan on the ability to rent it. Yeah, so this was an interesting one because again, I think at first the reception was quite positive, and then we started to hear from to Councillor Wells' point, from the other side, who had some concerns with it. I would also just for clarification say that, so again, these are all in the residential zones. In the commercial zones, we're going to treat short-term rentals no differently than any other what we call a tourist accommodation. So that would be like a hotel unit or a B&B. So the owner, the primary residence piece goes away. If you're in a commercial zone, you could operate a 10-unit building, and all of the units are short-term rentals. Nobody has to live on site. So they are quite different between the residential zones and the commercial zones. Yeah, so I just want to make that clear. In terms of the options that I'm presenting here, one would be to remove the requirement that the property be the primary residence of the operator. Two would be to exempt the existing short-term rentals from meeting all the new requirements. I'll come out and say I'm not recommending that one. It would just create a two-tiered system, and it would be difficult to administer and track.
Which one was that?
Option number two. And part of the reason for that is currently we don't actually issue permits for those uses. Because they come in while this plan was existing. We have an interpretation that allows them to exist, but they're not a permitted or prohibited use. They kind of just are using a residential property in a commercial capacity, and so we don't even have ourselves. We don't have permits.
Don't even know whether they're there.
That's right. So yeah.
And I don't want to complicate it, but everybody knows there's a work in progress to come up with a Lunenburg County sort of guideline and taxation policy for short-term rentals.
Right. Something we didn't really hear much about, but one option, currently we've prohibited short-term rentals in accessory dwelling units. So that would be a consideration. And then option 4, again, is to make no changes in that area. So I'll open that up to discussion.
Lauren, just follow up on your last comment. In the commercial zone, let's look at that for a moment. They can still be assessed residential, presumably, and that's not it. Is there any way to have them licensed so that we can regulate so if they are running short-term rentals in a commercial zone that they're actually paying commercial taxes?
Well, there is a process in the works where they will have to be registered and licensed.
We don't have that, and we can't put that in here, can we?
No, that's outside of the box.
Well, an assessment issue. Yeah.
It is an assessment issue which we don't control. But it makes no sense to me that you have a short-term rental, even if it's in a commercial zone, where you're paying residential taxes. If you have a ghost hotel sitting around in a residential zone, it's bad enough. But if you're in a commercial zone and you're running a commercial establishment,
you should be paying commercial
and a lot of these are not.
Yeah.
And that doesn't make any sense. We gotta fix that. I don't think, Garth, you can fix that.
Yeah, that would not be in the scope of the land use bylaw or the planning strategy.
No, but there's some new provincial guidelines associated with that. And
there's a provincial registration that's required. Yeah.
Municipalities are trying to work with that and then figure out how we can capture them all and how we can get them all to be permitted uses as opposed to just doing it without permits. And
is there any compromise on the existing ones, Garth, that some of some people have bought with the understanding under the existing rules where they could?
If council isn't happy with sort of the do it or the don't do it, again, I would not recommend bringing in new rules for new and letting the existing go as a free-for-all. What I would suggest, if there's an interest to go beyond, to really drill down beyond what's offered here, it would likely be a licensing bylaw, which would be separate from the land use bylaw. That would allow, similar to what we do with kennels and other types of things that we issue licenses for, it allows for inspections, or could allow for inspections. It could allow for regulation of much more fine-grained detail, potentially even how many nights per year it's rented if we want to get into tracking those kind of things. It could have penalties built in, which the land use bylaw doesn't. We're working for compliance or we take someone to court. It could also have provisions so that if a number of complaints were issued against a property in a given year, then they wouldn't be issued their license in the next year. So I guess one way of saying it is it allows more fine-grained, it allows dealing with short-term rentals across the board, regardless of where they are. And it also allows us to, I guess what you might say is deal with bad actors on an individual basis versus bringing in a regulation that affects everybody. Who writes that bylaw, administers it, all that, that's a whole, obviously a consideration, but that would be my suggestion if these types of options aren't palatable.
Andre?
I'm in favor of number one. I think that we should, unless it's your primary residence, you shouldn't have a short-term rental.
Okay.
I don't really have a grievance with it being in an accessory dwelling unit, so I guess it would be a combination of 1 and 3.
So just to clarify, so 1 would actually remove the requirement that it has to be primary residence. So I think you want to leave that as, yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
Yes, but
Go with 3.
that's what I'd like to see. I see that short-term rentals are a barrier for housing, which is a more important thing than tourism. Right now, it's in the news every day. Not to say tourism is important, but I mean, I just feel like we have some facilities for short-term accommodation, and 10, 15 years ago there was none of this, and somehow we managed on. And I just don't like it. I don't think, I'm not interested in people buying up properties and just turning them into short-term rentals. If you want to make a little extra income because you've got a facility in your house and you want to rent out something that's or in your garage or whatever, that's fine. But beyond that, no.
No, I don't. Yeah, I think they should be permanent residences.
Okay.
And I'm sorry that Tara's not here because she's better at remembering all this, but I mean, like I said, there is a permitting process in place that we'll be coming back to council shortly, and it will cover some of the issues that we're discussing.
When will it come back to us?
Oh, probably within a month or so. But it's outside of land use. It deals with just short-term rentals and how we deal with them, how we register them, how we tax them.
Although they do work together, so I think we need to see that as soon as we can.
Well, you will, but it's just that we had to wait for provincial legislation and then try to deal with it.
I get that.
Okay.
Gareth, do you have a definition of primary residence? A lot of these houses, the people, maybe they're part-time primary, but they live in Halifax or somewhere else.
Right. That is I think a work in progress. The province does have a definition. It's I don't have it in front of me, but it's somewhat vague. It says, a dwelling or residence where someone is normally resident or something. It's very, it almost doesn't say much of anything. So I've spoken with our development team, and they had anticipated working with yourself to come up with a definition of what combination of evidence might constitute.
I know it can be tricky. That's
yes.
why I'm curious.
Yeah. So it's a good question and something that we're going to continue to develop. We've talked about a power bill or something is not sufficient in and of its own. So there's going to have to be some sort of combination of documents. So that would be the details on specifically what would be.
Where do they vote? Where do they cast a ballot?
Yep.
That's one.
That'd be one
criteria.
Yeah.
I think we need to see that as well. I mean, this is to me one of the more difficult areas to deal with because of in my view, the unfairness of taking away something that someone already has. Going forward, if you know the rules, you play by the rules. If you change the rules, I have some difficulty with that. So I need to see that definition.
Okay.
Well, that would be part of it. We just need to give some direction on where we want to go with this.
But yes, that in the next draft or the final draft 2 or final draft, whatever it is, we would have that. If council would like to continue along the lines of primary residence, then yes, we would develop that definition.
Yeah, okay, so we'll continue on with
I
that.
don't think we can until we know what it means.
Okay.
I can't.
Okay. Okay. So no decision there.
No.
Okay. I'll need some direction at the end, just like
Yes,
these other issues.
understood.
Yep.
Well, get us a definition of primary work.
Okay, so I mean, then we need to have a conversation about what are we,
Yeah.
what are we doing
What's the
today?
intent?
Yeah, yeah.
Do you want people from outside buying up properties and
Yeah,
putting
what-
them in
what-
short-term
what-
rentals or not?
What in the definition would make you
If I said
happy or not
straightforward, do
happy?
you like me, yes or no, check the box.
No,
And then we'll get a definition, and if we don't like the definition,
We can,
then we can alter the definition
Change
to
it.
something.
yeah, yeah.
But I don't think any of us want people buying houses and turning them into short-term rentals when there's.
In a residential zone.
Yes, when
Right,
there's such a
exactly.
housing crisis.
And that was the same thinking with, as it's currently drafted, that you wouldn't be able to rent an accessory dwelling unit. The same thing is that we would hope, or, well, if it stays the same way, if you build an accessory dwelling unit, it has to be used for some other type of housing other than tourist.
Just a short-term.
That's right, right. And there's a provincial program actually just announced last week, I believe, where a homeowner can apply for $25,000 loan to build a secondary suite. And for the life of the loan, you can't use it as a short-term rental. So I think we're moving in the right area,
Yeah.
personally.
Yeah.
Could we have a lesser, something less than 28 days for the term?
We could, but then we're moving away from the provincial. So rather than mirroring the provincial, I would question why we would want to. I mean, no, actually, I wouldn't question why. Yes, we could define it. It would raise a question as, do we need then a third category? So we have long-term rentals, 28 days plus. We have short-term rentals,
28
10 days or lesser. What's in between? What 10 to 28? What is that? Medium-term rental? Do we have different regulations for those?
Yeah.
Like, no, seriously, like that would be what we'd have to do, I think. Yeah.
Very good question. Just
Yeah.
because the province has it doesn't make it right.
No, that's right.
That's definitely true. But, you know, I think in historically, people would buy vacation properties in Chester, and I think we're cognizant that there's a fairly large population of folks that come here and enjoy our community for the summertime, and then some of them will sit idle, but those who wished to recover a little bit of revenue would put it out, and they would rent it for sometimes 9 months or something like that, and that was
Understood.
a real benefit to people that, you know, would hang out or camp or do something through the summer, and then they had a place to live in the winter time, and it worked out for everybody involved. And then when short-term rentals came, in some cases that option was extinguished. And I think we need to put something in place to make it a little more appealing.
No, I
If
agree
we
with
don't
that.
recover some money, then it benefits people that need housing.
Yeah,
Okay.
so that's the direction.
Okay, so maintain, but come back obviously with specific
definition.
definitions. Great.
We gotta try to make some kind of progress.
Okay, so the next one is architectural controls, and this is an interesting one because there's a section in the land use bylaw that is titled architectural controls, and then there's a whole bunch of provisions throughout the document that are related to character and architecture, and that may have been where some of the misunderstanding was here. So as I said in the first bullet here, it wasn't generally well received, and in my opinion, probably not understood, and that may have contributed to how it was received. There were many comments speaking to how the proposed plan is weakening or not protecting character, when in fact, most of the existing architectural controls are carried forward, and we've added a decent number of new ones as well. Some of the ones we talked about already, for example, were the maximum footprints and lot coverage in the R1 zone. That's not in the architectural control section, but it certainly has an effect on character and the look and feel of an area. So we heard, rightly so, that architectural design is a key element, and in the opinions that were expressed, needs more protection. There are some proposals in the draft plan specifically that received some pushback, so around allowing some exemptions for unfinished concrete and vinyl siding, and the options. We'll go through some changes there. And then we also heard that the best solution would be a design review committee that would review the appropriateness of each new development before it was issued a permit. So those were some of the feedback, and again, the full slate is in the report and the attachments there. So if we look at the options, and this may be where we want to potentially, almost everybody has a copy of the document, so if we do want to flip into the section itself to remove it. But so essentially what's in there now is there is an allowance for unfinished concrete block and vinyl sidings on structures over 1,500 square feet. It was pretty clear, it's not that the whole structure to be covered, it's up to a percentage of the structure. It was pretty clearly expressed that was not desired, and I think that's fair. Generally, when we get those larger structures, they're just of their own choices using what we might call a higher quality of materials, and so I think removing that exemption just clarifies things that we expect maybe a higher quality design there. One that I think was a little more, we heard from both sides, there is an exemption that buildings less than 1,500 square feet in footprint would be able to be clad in vinyl siding. And so there was some concern expressed with that, but then there's also an affordability question, and we do have in various parts of the village very modest homes that would be in that size range, and aren't so that was another option, would be to remove that exemption or not. Oh yes.
Do you have a phone with it?
Oh, sorry, sure, yes. Let me.
Everyone talking word.
Thank you.
Clear on the table.
Page 52 of the land use bylaw. Apology, yeah, Abdullah, you've got the secondary plan there, so you want there's two documents in there.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. One's the land use bylaw and one is the
So we want the land use bylaw.
the land use bylaw, yeah.
And what page was
Page 52. I think. Jeez. There we go. Okay, so for everybody, so the secondary plan is first. So about halfway through, there's a yellow page dividing the documents.
Yep.
And then beyond that is the land use bylaw.
Page 52 in the second paragraph.
That's right. Apologies, these were just the extra copies we had over at the desk. There we go. So, yeah, so basically starting at the top of page 52, this is the architectural control section. So you'll see here, this particular what we're talking about is if we go down to D, buildings with a footprint greater than 140 meters squared, which is 1,500 square feet, must limit the use of vinyl siding, unfinished concrete, or concrete block to less than 25% of the public facade. So that would be option one. That's what we're talking about in option one. It would be to remove that exemption to basically say there's no allowance for vinyl siding on those larger structures.
Yeah.
And then like I said, the other piece that we heard was, should vinyl siding just be basically prohibited outright? Because as this is drafted, it would allow it for smaller structures. And so there were some comments that vinyl siding on any size structure really is inappropriate in the village. So that would be option two, reflective there. Option three is talking about the design review committee. And again, there would need to be some research done there just to exactly how that would work. That would have some significant implications on how development occur, if it's possible, because that would be presumably every development permit issue needs to go to committee for review and discussion and potentially revision of design. It's significant change.
I don't like that.
And then option four, and this is somewhat open-ended, would be to draft some additional architectural regulations. So that could potentially include a wider list of prohibited materials, so or other types of design elements. Like I said, we just heard overall that the document doesn't go far enough to protect character and architecture, and so virtually all of the recommendations from the FBM report on character design and the village character and how to protect it, we have implemented here. But of course, we could go, go further and get into, more.
But the biggest ones are the vinyl siding type pieces.
I think from what's written, that was what received the most.
I'm going to speak for myself, but I mean, removing it on the very large structures probably isn't an issue.
I think that's probably a fairly easy decision.
Because if they're building those, they can.
Right. That would be the presumption. Yep.
We did have the element study done, we did have a public consultation on that, and you incorporated pretty much the consensus from that.
Right.
Makes sense.
How is it that we're potentially okay with vinyl siding, but we're not okay with metal siding?
That's that's kind of the line we're on. Is like I think that's a fair point. Maybe if one's allowed, should both be, or if one's prohibited, should.
I didn't realize we were lumping the two together.
Further G, metal siding would be prohibited under G, but metal roofing would be allowed. So.
There's a lot of people going with metal roofs as opposed to shingles anymore.
And we've made an exemption for metal roofs because you're right, that's
a trend away.
And it seems to be more sustainable or
they last
tougher. Yes, that's right. With our hurricanes and it sounds like there's potentially consensus around removing the exemption on the larger structures.
It's just a question of what we're going to do with the smaller.
I'm happy with what you've proposed of only allowing up to 25%, I think it is. So
on the larger ones?
With vinyl siding, I think if you're building in Chester, you shouldn't be putting vinyl siding in your house.
No.
So that just leave it. It's too ugly.
And what about on any size? Is that?
I don't care what the size.
Yeah. Okay.
No more than 25%.
So what we could do, that would be essentially we could remove the allowance on the larger structures and then say for the smaller structures up to 25%. That would be sort of a compromise there between 1 and 2.
When you say unfinished concrete block, I'm thinking about like masonry block, like the big block, industrial.
Yeah, or cinder block kind of thing. Or that
but sometimes there's these faux, like veneer.
Right, stone.
Is that?
Yeah, that
looks like granite.
I would say that would, in my opinion, I would say that would be a more of a finish. Just like polished concrete wouldn't necessarily be prohibited if it was, this is unfinished concrete or concrete block. So I think
sometimes you see these like faux, like these veneers of faux stone and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So what does this? Is it silent on that? Or
I would say it generally is silent on that unless.
I feel like that should be also limited to some extent. Eventually, it's
sure.
It gets pretty grotesque when there's a lot of it.
Yeah, we could.
Yeah, wooden structures, that's the character of the village.
And that would essentially be
I would limit that also to 25% personally.
Right. Okay, yeah. And we'll look into the sort of the wording, but essentially, I know what you mean, the faux, the fake stone siding,
Sam?
Gareth, how do we address things like fire code requirements when you're near a side boundary? You gotta put something in like metal or cement.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think.
Lots of times you do, nowadays.
There is a general statement in our provisions that we have it today, and it's pretty standard in all land use bylaws, that say nothing in this bylaw can override the safety side of it. So we did have, for example, the Forsyth Gallery. They rebuilt the lodge, and because the old building was wood, and the closest of it was right on the line, they did actually have to do a concrete wall to meet that building code requirement.
As long as there is an exemption for safety.
Yeah, okay, that's fine, they have to meet it, but are we telling them particularly what, say they want to go with metal and you're going to say, no, you have to go with cement or vice versa?
No, normally it would come down to what the building inspector says they need, because based on their conditions, like,
Wouldn't he just say you need something that meets a fire rating of such and such and such and such?
Well, I would,
And then, okay,
Yeah.
and then maybe there's a variety of products that would meet that fire rating. I'm just curious,
that's
if
valid.
they needed that kind of detail.
yeah, I hadn't considered the non-combustible construction aspect of it.
Yeah.
What type of siding did the theater have between our building and the theater? The only reason that law building is standing is because of the siding.
I don't know.
New siding they put in, which was fire retardant. You know what kind of siding that was?
I don't, no, I wasn't involved with that.
Can we find out, because that was steel siding, I'm in favor of steel siding.
So what is currently on the Playhouse?
No, that was previous.
Previously on the
They
Playhouse?
just, the previous build,
Okay,
they had combustible siding on the old building.
right,
On the new
okay, yes.
build, it's
Non-combustible.
non-combustible, that's what saved.
So, yeah, we would have to have some provisions for
Sure.
code-related,
Yeah.
non-combustible siding or
I'm
cladding.
not sure that was code, probably code related, because it's only 4 foot.
Yes, that's what it would have been. It would have,
They would have had to meet fire code.
Yeah.
they need 8-foot separation or something before you go in.
Yeah, we have to make an exemption for meeting fire regulations.
Sure, yeah.
But even then, we want to be a little stricter about the type of cladding. You know, somehow we have to get some protection around it. You know, there's lots of non-combustible claddings. So again, we don't want to have an unfinished masonry block wall there, which would meet the fire code requirements, but it's really ugly.
Yeah.
There are other non-combustible options that are less grotesque.
Yeah, and we could try to word it in that, say that, you know, there's an exemption for fire non-combustible, but use of the, you know, most appropriate, or the material most in keeping with, or something.
The character
like,
of the
right, something to that effect, so that you don't
It's a
necessarily.
little wishy-washy though, yeah, that's the trouble with it.
Yeah.
Well, I look forward to hearing what you come back with.
You have to come up with some wording that works.
Yeah, sure.
One of the things that, to switch gears here a little bit, I mentioned a couple times was the site itself. I've been in other jurisdictions where the vegetation's been removed and replaced with aggregate or hardscapes.
Right, yes.
Is that in here?
It's not.
It should be.
Okay, if that's, but if that's the direction, and front yard only, all yards, percentages.
I don't think that we want people that take up their lawns and replace them with aggregate. It's, you know, we're not Bridgewater,
right,
or Tulsa.
Yeah. Yeah, we want vegetation to remain.
You're gonna make me mow my lawn forever?
No, you don't have to live in Chester.
Now, what about, I guess, since we're into it, what about naturalized lawns and naturalized landscaping? You know, the idea of letting it grow, and that's fine.
You have to control your grounds.
What about agriculture?
That's a good question.
Well, I've seen it.
Yeah,
No,
natural.
natural.
Well, yeah, it's better for
It
the
should be
environment.
turf
Yeah, and
or
stormwater.
gardens.
Yeah.
You're getting into a position where you're getting really intrusive.
Well, to take a drive down Glen Allen Drive in Bridgewater, and then you may change your mind.
Yeah, no, I don't.
It's
I'm
bad.
not big into artificial lawns.
And that could happen here, just because people decide they think they're gonna bypass mowing their grass. It's bad. We don't want that here.
Okay, yeah, we can bring something back from that.
How far along are we? We're ways away, aren't we?
We are maybe a quarter.
Okay. We're gonna take a 10-minute break, because some of them need to cup of coffee, washroom trip, that kind of stuff.